This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality.
Ed Marks woke from another dream about his wife. In this one, she'd been standing right in front of him, wearing a white gown that rippled in a breeze he couldn't feel. In her arms, she held a baby too small and raw-looking to be alive. Ed was so grateful to see her again, and in the dream he wondered why he hadn't done this sooner. He reached for her hand until a voice stopped him. "You can't touch her." For a few moments Ed lay there wiping at the corners of his eyes, hanging on to the dream and the last remnants of sleep, and praying both would return. It was spring, finally warm enough to sleep with the windows open. They let in some cool night air, a bit of gray light from street lamps and neighbors' porches, and the sharp, piercing sound of a bird's cry. Not bird's song, or the busy chatter of robins and wrens greeting one another just before sunrise. This was more like a question. 2 notes, the second higher, repeated twice as though asking, "Who's there? Who's there?" Then 4 identical chirps and a 5th that rose again, demanding an answer. "No, no, no, no one?" A pause, then the whole thing began all over again. "Who's there? Who's there? No, 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 no one?" It broke through the night like a child's cry. Ed glanced at the bedside clock. 3:38. "Who's there? Who's there?" the bird wanted to know. "No, no, no, no one?" He turned toward the empty side of the bed, trying to block out the bird and the clamor of his own damned thoughts. He got up and closed the window, but the sound leaked through the glass. A pillow over his head only made him feel as though he were suffocating. The house felt empty and too big around him. He and Ellen had planned on filling it with kids, 2 or 3, maybe more. It was situated in a quiet neighborhood that bordered on a little woods, perfect for hiking and picnics. A place where the children could play when they got old enough not to worry about every moment of the day. Ed tried to fall back asleep. He turned on the white noise machine he'd bought for nights just like this. He used a breathing technique he'd read about online. He even repeated the mantra a well-meaning coworker had suggested after he returned to the office. And he thought of the saying, the horribly cynical one, about how our plans make God laugh. The clock crawled on to 4 and 4:30. The bird continued its late-night inquiries without pause or response. At some point, the sun broke over the horizon, and for a moment, everything grew still. Ed drifted back to sleep. Then the alarm rang. That morning, Ed saw his neighbor as they both walked to their cars. Chris was the father of 3 lively boys, with the perpetual look of someone both grateful for and exhausted by his good fortune. They waved. Chris crossed his yard to ask how Ed was doing these days. "Great," Ed told him. "Good. Okay. You know." He changed the subject. "Hey, did you hear that bird last night? What a racket." Chris smiled and looked around. "Yeah? Where?" "In the woods, I think." Ed gestured at the trees beyond their block. "You didn't hear it? All night long." Chris's face darkened, and he shook his head. "Yeah, no. Sharon says I sleep like a rock and snore like a buzzsaw. She probably couldn't hear it either." He glanced at his watch. "Gotta run, but really, come over for that beer, okay?" Ed watched him get into his car and back out on the drive. From inside the woods, a flock of birds rose up, as though startled by something, making a black whirlpool in the sky. That night, Ed turned on the bedroom TV and flipped through the channels until he found a nature documentary on one of the science channels. He set the timer for 2 hours and settled into his pillow, letting the narrator's somber voice lull him to sleep. For a few minutes, the bed seemed to drift on a gentle wave. He closed his eyes. Then he was awake again, in the dark. "Who's there? Who's there?" Ed groaned and looked at the clock. 3:47. No, 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 no one? For a moment he considered getting up and closing the bedroom window, then remembered it already was. The bird's cry went on like an unanswered phone, a constant knocking at the door, a car alarm that would not stop. For a while, Ed wondered if it might not be a bird at all, but some other kind of animal, maybe something that didn't belong here, something lost and alone, in some type of despair or agony. The longer it went on, the more things Ed heard in its cries. Who's there became what now, and then why me? No, 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 no one changed its shape until he heard you too, and finally, now what? Ed groaned and threw back the blankets. He opened the window and stared in the direction of the woods. No question. It was definitely coming from somewhere in there. It was spring, after all. The damned thing was probably a male, driven by instinct and the recent change of seasons, announcing himself, claiming his territory, calling for a female to join him. When one finally did, they'd engage in whatever mating ritual nature called for, then build a nest and lay some eggs, 2 or 3, maybe more. Then they'd hatch, and the offspring would grow until they were big enough to leave the nest. Next spring, they'd return, starting the whole thing all over again, more and more each year, until the woods rang with their cries like a city filled with sirens. No. Maybe Chris and Sharon could sleep through this now, but none of them would pass a night in peace if a family, or God forbid a whole flock of the things, made the woods their home. Who's there? Who's there? The bird called out. Ed pictured him, high in his tree, puffed up and squawking at the top of his goddamn little lungs. No way, no way. Ed shook his head at the darkness outside and the woods beyond. No way in hell. He didn't own a real gun, just the Daisy air rifle his father had given him as a child to take on their hunting trips. It was good for squirrels and smaller rabbits, which his father would coax into the open with sounds created by his voice and hands. Ed never quite got the knack of the calls, but he turned out to be a pretty good shot for a kid. He'd planned on giving the rifle to his own son or daughter someday. It was buried deep in the basement, past boxes packed with the things a married couple collects over 8 or 9 years, stuff he hadn't planned on going through for some time yet, and wasn't prepared to deal with now. The baby things they'd bought when Ellen got pregnant were already gone. He'd gotten rid of those right away. But there was still plenty of stuff from before. Their first set of dishes, saved in old newspapers for the weekend place they promised to buy. A box of autographed books and souvenirs from one of Ellen's jobs at a local talk show. Holiday decorations that he hadn't even bothered to open last Christmas. And photos. So many photos. He couldn't bear to look at them or stop himself from it. He felt like there was a hole inside him, one so large it managed to both fill him up and hollow him out. The box of pellets was further back. As soon as he found it, he turned around and left the mess behind him, then climbed the stairs and shut the door. The rifle was smaller than he remembered, but would do the job. With luck, it'd kill the damn thing. At the very least, it'd give the bird a good kick in the ass and chase it off for good. He loaded the rifle just before sunset, then grabbed a garbage bag full of empty beer cans and went out to the edge of the woods. After all those years, the gun still worked, and after a few shots, his aim sharpened right up. He headed back into the house, the rifle propped against one shoulder. It occurred to him that he hadn't been back there since Ellen had left her note. In the woods for a walk, it said. Love you. The walks became a regular thing after she started showing. The pregnancy made her legs ache, and walking eased the pain. On bad days, she'd go in the morning and afternoon. She loved seeing the leaves change and had discovered a talent for spotting birds on their way south for the winter. She'd come home, breathless over a group of waxwings or starlings she'd seen, the occasional merlin or owl. The last time was just like every other time, until the sun started going down and she still hadn't returned or called. At first he waited, busying himself and trying not to worry. And then he did worry and dialed her cell phone, only to hear it ringing in the bedroom upstairs. He stood at the living room window, sure he'd see her coming up the walk, her cheeks flushed from the chill and excitement over some new species. He waited a few more minutes as the light left the autumn sky. Then he threw on a jacket and left the house. None of the neighbors he passed along the way had seen her. Darkness was falling by the time he reached the woods. He ran into the trees, calling out for her, sure she'd answer and he could begin feeling silly about panicking over nothing. "Ha ha, there you are. Let's go home and get some dinner." But he only found dark and quiet. He covered the length of her favorite trail, winded from the effort and shouting her name. Dread wrapped itself around his chest. He moved on to the smaller paths, scanning the woods for a spot of color, anything vaguely Ellen-shaped, while cursing himself for not bringing a flashlight. When he finally found her, she was slumped against a tree trunk on one of the little paths near the entrance. He said her name and ran faster when she didn't respond. Even in the dark, he could tell her color wasn't right. She was pale, seeming to glow in the gloom. When he knelt down to touch her face, it was cooler than it should have been. Her hands rested in her lap, her legs crossed at the ankles. She wore one of her funny little crocheted hats and the only jacket she owned that still fit. She looked as though she'd grown tired and sat down against the tree for a nap, then slipped past it and into death. He said, "Ellen, Ellen," and no, please, please, no, and finally just animal-like cries that tore their way out of his throat and disappeared into the treetops. He left her just long enough to find the nearest house with lights on and tell them to call 911, then rushed back and held her until police and the ambulance arrived. The paramedics did all the things he'd seen on TV. By the time they loaded her into the ambulance, a dozen or so people from the neighborhood had gathered to see what all the lights and sirens were about. They watched while Ed asked all the paramedics and every cop what had happened, how it could have happened. An officer with the last name of Campbell finally led him away and walked him home. He repeated condolences and recommendations that Ed call someone to come be with him. He promised the coroner would contact him in a day or two, as soon as he knew something more. Ed leaned the air rifle against his front door and placed a flashlight with fresh batteries next to it. He turned on the TV but didn't really watch it. After a few hours, he shut everything down and crawled into bed with his clothes still on. Insomnia kept him company through the night, reminding him of things he and Ellen had done together, times they'd made love, unforgivable things he'd said during fights, mistakes that were past all hope of ever undoing. There were pills in the bathroom he could take, ones his doctor had promised would dull the edge, a phrase that always made Ed think of a knife held to his throat. They left him feeling slow and stupid the next morning and did nothing for the sharp pain between his heart and gut. He spent the dark hours listening through the open window, past his neighbors' sleeping houses, over street lamps and asphalt roads and into the woods. He waited for the call of what he'd come to think of as the night crier. "Who's there? Who's there?" Ed hurried downstairs. He grabbed the rifle and flashlight and went outside. The night air felt like ice water against his skin. He headed toward the woods, stopping every few yards to listen, adjusting his course each time the bird cried out. He marveled at the darkened houses around him, at the way so many others could sleep through this, their husbands and wives beside them, their children safe in the next room. He crossed the street, stopping at the tree line. It was colder here, darker too. It smelled of moist earth and things that were alive, waiting to emerge. He listened for the night crier's call. "Who's there? Who's there?" he asked from the edge of the woods. No answer. He tried again, pitching his voice like a man searching for a lost pet. Still nothing. He snapped on the flashlight and swept it over the trees, which stood like a crowd with their backs to him. Ed made his way between the trunks, his footsteps crackling over last autumn's dead twigs and fallen leaves. He wondered if the night crier was close by, watching and knowing who he was and what he had in mind. "Who's there?" he called, scanning the black lace of branches above him. "Who's there?" When the coroner finally called, Ed had to ask how the term was spelled so he could write it down and look it up. The man on the phone said Ellen had passed away due to a pulmonary embolism. A blood clot, quite massive, he remarked with some clinical fascination, had formed in one of the veins of her leg. Something, it was impossible to say exactly what, had jarred it loose, sending it on its way to her lungs and cutting off her oxygen. It was rare, he said, but not unheard of in pregnant women. A few seconds passed while Ed processed the information. How was all he could say. The coroner exhaled. With some women, the baby, he stopped and began again. In certain pregnancies, the fetus, during gestation, compresses the left iliac vein, and that causes blood to back up, potentiating the clot. It can remain there, where it sometimes causes pain. It can also dislodge and move into the lungs, as it did in the case of your wife. I'm sorry. She complained about her legs, Ed told him. That's why she walked. She said it made them feel better. Yes, well, these things can come on suddenly. Even with treatment, it's a serious condition. The coroner shuffled some papers, ones that Ed imagined said treatment had not been an option. I'm very sorry for your loss. Ed called for the night crier. Who's there? Who's there? He asked. No one, apparently. Nothing. He wondered what he'd expected to find. Something with brilliant plumage? Perched at eye level like a product on a shelf? In truth, the bird was probably some dun-colored thing, tough to spot during the day, perfectly camouflaged against the grays and blacks of the woods at night. Who's there? Who's there? He called. He waited for an answer or sound, anything he could follow, scurrying below, fluttering above. Who's there? Who's there? He asked again, no longer expecting a reply. Breeze stirred the branches overhead. Then the night went silent. Ed cast the flashlight's beam around the empty woods. You and me. Something in him coiled. It was not a bird's call this time, but a voice, coming from above and behind him. Ed spun, aiming the rifle with one hand and the flashlight with the other. The beam danced across the treetops. Who's there? Now he sounded like a man with an intruder in his home. His finger curled around the trigger. Something rustled above him. Ed swung the rifle and flashlight toward it. You and me. A woman's voice, soft but resonant like a violin note that stirs something deep within the chest. At first he saw only branches that had not yet burst into leaves. Then a face dipped into view. A woman's face. He forgot the rifle, letting out a breath of fascination that bloomed in the cool air like a mushroom. You and me, she said. Her mouth was open, but still. Instead, her throat worked up and down as she spoke. Her head turned, regarding him with one curious eye and then the other. You and me, she repeated, and seemed to smile. He blinked, once, twice, willing himself to wake up, sure he must be dreaming again. He stepped back, hoping the tangle of a blanket and sheet around his legs would rouse him from sleep. Instead, his heel caught a fallen branch, and he fell backward. The flashlight went wild. The rifle clattered away. Before he could right himself, the night crier had descended from the trees, landing at his feet. She shook and stretched herself and performed a series of dainty steps, first to the left and then the right. She was unlike anything he'd ever seen or could have dreamed of, something both more and less than human. A covering of light down sprouted from the tops of her feet and continued up to her shoulders. Her arms hovered behind her, thrusting her chest forward so that it presented two small but perfectly formed breasts. Neat rows of pin feathers layered the space between her legs. Ed could not take his eyes away and felt himself stiffen at the sight of her. You and me, she cooed, tilting her head, appraising him. You and me. He scrambled blindly for the rifle stock. The crab walked away, hoping to gain enough space to stand and fight or turn and run, but her movements were quick and too closely matched to his. His hand slipped on the muddy ground and landed him flat on his back. The night crier drew closer, dropping her head toward his. Then her lips parted. She opened her mouth, and something inside Ed, some long unmet animal need, demanded that he do the same. In the flashlight's glow, Ed saw a tongue too pointed to be human and rows of tiny thorn-like teeth around it, made for grasping things and holding them. Her jaws stretched, opening wider. They did not bite, but latched over his mouth and nose like a mask. Her tongue emerged, probing more deeply than he would have thought possible, finding and following the contours of his throat. She seemed to be filling him up and emptying him out at the same time. The breath in his lungs rushed out of him and flowed into her. As the stars above began to fade, Ed realized his mistake. It hadn't been a mating call he'd heard these past few nights and followed into the woods. Not mating at all, but hunting. As a boy, he'd watched in wonder as his father lured animals from their hiding places. Not just squirrels and rabbits, but fox and raccoon too, waterfowl of all kinds, great elk and deer. Lonely males, his father said, shaking his head after the kill, are always looking for a mate. Ed struggled the way all doomed things do. Darkness descended around him, like the mouth of a black bag closing over his head. The last thing he saw were the night crier's eyes, looking into his own with a predator's cool gaze and an angel's warm embrace. Ed let himself go and be taken. Where, he didn't know, but he hoped that when he arrived, he would no longer be alone. At some point, the sun broke over the horizon, and for a moment, everything grew still. When he was finally gone, the night crier was too.
That was The Night Crier, written and read by Michael Cook. This story was originally published in the Horror Library, Volume 6, in 2017.
Hi, Michael. Welcome at last to the Strange Recital.
Hey guys, I'm glad we finally got a chance to talk. Thanks for having me on the podcast. Once again.
Yeah, we weren't able to interview you due to time restrictions when we featured a previous story of yours, The Woman in the White Impala. So I'm glad it worked out this time, and we're finally able to talk. If that is in fact what we're actually doing. But tell us about your writing career so far.
Aside from writing when I was very young, my writing career probably began when I was a film student, when I was writing a script and suddenly realized, yeah, I've got a tremendous amount of freedom here.
Yeah.
Professionally, I started as an advertising copywriter.
Mm-hmm.
That eventually led to online stuff, magazine articles, short stories, and then most recently, a novel.
I'm curious about your decision to work in the horror category. The creepiness factor can be a fascinating challenge for a writer, I know, but one thing I've noticed in your work, and it's visible in The Night Crier, is that you balance it with heart, or we might say empathy. Do you have a philosophy that guides you?
Yeah. Well, as far as the horror category goes, I don't think I chose it as much as it chose me. I've always gravitated toward the strange in terms of what I enjoy being entertained by. So when it came time to write, that's just naturally what I did. I wanted to make other people feel the way I enjoy being made to feel,
Yeah.
Despite that, I don't think I've written a single thing that could be categorized as traditional horror. Certainly no vampires or werewolves, at least not yet. There has been a ghost or two, and certainly some strange, unconventional monsters, like in The Night Crier. I guess I've just always preferred the weird, sometime with a touch of cosmic horror. It's a niche I think The Strange Recital occupies nicely, one that you both do very well.
Thank you.
In terms of a philosophy, it's probably the belief that the saddest things can also be the most frightening, because sadness, in one form or another, visits us all. It's something we're all familiar with. And things like the loss of independence or loved ones or health or status, those can be terrifying things to contemplate, at least to me.
Mm-hmm.
Recently, I've also seen people use the terms tragic or tragedy to describe certain stories that are either horror adjacent or end in horrifying ways. So that's a point of view that I'm definitely sympathetic to as well.
Now, what was your original inspiration for The Night Crier?
Well, very similar to the story itself, actually. I woke up one night to the sound of birds, or actually just one bird in particular, that just kept repeating the same call over and over again, which of course kept me from falling back to sleep. And what I wanted to do more than anything was to go outside and track down the source of this sound. And that got me wondering what strange thing I might find alone in the middle of the night.
To embody grief in the form of a hungry beast is a very creative and empathic idea. And forgive me for a bit of departure here, but your story reminded me of a short poem by Stephen Crane, whose work was quite influential on me as a teenager, and whose childhood home in Asbury Park, New Jersey, I visited recently. It's called In the Desert. In the desert, I saw a creature, naked, bestial, who, squatting upon the ground, held his heart in his hands and ate of it. I said, "Is it good, friend?" "It is bitter, bitter," he answered. "But I like it, because it is bitter, and because it is my heart." Any thoughts about that?
Oh, yeah, so many. First of all, that's not lovely, but potent. I can certainly understand why Joyce Carol Oates would choose those last two lines for the title of a novel. Second, I'm reminded of how recently there's been a fair amount of critical musing about horror or horrifying stories being a metaphor for grief.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking about films here primarily. The work of Mike Flanagan and Ari Aster come to mind. Also the movie Talk to Me, which I finally watched right before Halloween. Oddly enough, in The Night Crier, the element of grief actually appeared in later drafts. I once had a writing teacher who said, and I hope I can at least get close to the way she put it, that a short story really needs to tell at least two stories in order to be complete. I find myself thinking about that a lot as I search for the beginning, middle, and end of something. It wasn't until I introduced the idea of Ed losing his wife and unborn child that those two stories were finally present. And that was when the whole thing started coming together, because those two stories then could sort of talk to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I was able to start adding details and small touches that kind of resonate and strengthen each other and the story as a whole. That was like the third story of Ed and his father hunting and making animal calls.
One thing I like about the story is the way you've set it among average people in an ordinary neighborhood, where the expectation is of safety and comfort. But the monster can be anywhere, because it's an internal monster. Ed wakes up from a dream and wipes tears from his eyes. A subtle way of saying he's the night crier. Human psychology provides its own terrors.
Wow, Tom. Would you believe that in all the time I've spent with this story, I've never once made that association.
Hmm.
So thank you for being a very good reader.
You're welcome.
I wrote this story when I was living in Chicago, and initially Ed Marks did as well. But as I worked on it, I realized the setting needed to be somewhere a bit more isolated
Mm-hmm.
and wild. So I moved Ed to what I had always pictured as one of those new suburban developments, where there are still plenty of trees and empty land nearby.
Mm-hmm.
And then that environment also struck me as a good counterpoint to Ed's circumstances, being surrounded by all those families, those parents and children, just made him seem that much more alone.
Yeah.
Strangely enough, last year I left Chicago and moved to Madison, where I now live in one of those new suburban developments. And there is a little woods not too far from my home.
Well, let's hope the bird doesn't come back.
Uh-oh, be careful. Well, I'd like to commend you for some good technique, economically achieving vivid impressions. For example, when a flock of birds rises up, making a black whirlpool in the sky, or when Ed feels a hole inside him, one so large it managed to both fill him up and hollow him out. Do you do much revising? Tell us about your writing process.
Hey, well, thank you. Yeah, I do a lot of revising. Fortunately, it's the part of the process that I enjoy the most. A story, for me, typically starts with just an image or an observation, maybe an event. There's certainly no beginning, middle, and end. So consequently, first drafts tend to be difficult and time-consuming as I try to find those three pillars. And as I look for them, it's also not unusual for me to make a few wrong turns.
Mm-hmm.
But when that first draft is finally done, that's when I can begin to do the things that really come more easily to me. And that's, finding and supporting themes and adding associations that can resonate. Things I like to think of as grace notes, sentence structure, word choices, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
I also like to play a lot with contradictions, like in the example you just gave, because I believe people can often feel two ways about a thing. But it's in the revisions and revisions to the revisions where my subconscious can really insert things like Tom's observation. And for me, that's where most of the fun is.
The Night Crier is a few years old. What writing projects are you working on lately?
Funnily enough, right now, it's more stories about wildlife.
Really?
You've probably seen those news stories about coyotes and other kinds of animals moving into the cities and adapting so quickly and so well to urban life.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got me thinking. Of course, there's a long line of nature run amok tales going back, at least to H.G. Wells' Food of the Gods and running all the way up to last year's Cocaine Bear. So the challenge really is bringing something new to that party.
Mm.
What I keep thinking about is the idea of the food chain and how when we were taught it in school, it always had us at the top. But when you really think about it, it isn't really a chain at all. It's actually more like a circle.
Yeah, I think you're onto something. There's a kind of anthropocentric arrogance ingrained in our species. The food chain is a circle. Or maybe a rhombus or parallelogram. I just love shapes. Sorry, I'm digressing.
Well, it would be fun to talk about The Woman in the White Impala, too. A unique time travel story, very different from The Night Crier. But unfortunately, our time's up. Thank you for joining us, Michael.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you both. It's been a real pleasure, and thanks so much for supporting short fiction.
At my house, it's not a bird waking me up in the night, it's the coyotes, yipping and howling like some kind of mad blood party. Unless it's all in my head.
Yeah, it most likely is. like those fisher cats and all your sangrivorous insects. This is The Strange Recital on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was Scent of Broken Stones by Arastu. This is episode 23111.